In this video, we will examine the role played by actors, namely Stalin and Truman, that led to the start of the Cold War.
So let's take a look at Stalin and how he shaped the Cold War to become what it is. Stalin had been the undisputed leader of the USSR by the 1930s, and he led the Soviet Union through the Second World War and then the beginning of the Cold War until his death in 1953. So tensions had already been developing on the eve of the Second World War, with Stalin's suspicions of the Western powers' policy of appeasement towards Germany, which he believed to be a conspiracy to counter the USSR. Further enhancing Stalin's suspicions of the West was the delay in the opening of the Second Front during the Second World War by the Western Allies, which in Stalin's mind was an attempt to place the burden of fighting the Germans with the Soviet Union. It is with all these suspicions of the West that Stalin attended the Tehran, Moscow, Yalta and Potsdam conferences, and entered the post-war era with suspicion that the Western powers wanted to interfere in the affairs of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It did not help that the Western powers had a policy of assisting the recovery of Germany, which Stalin and Soviet Union could not tolerate due to their paranoid fear of attack, as justified by two major German invasions in the past 50 years. Stalin believed that the Western powers were attempting to contain him with what he dubbed to be Western imperialism in his Bolshoi theatre speech of 1946, a mindset that cemented the Sovietization of Eastern Europe to safeguard Russia and contributed to the Berlin Blockade of 1948. So throughout this whole period, we see that Stalin harbored deep suspicions towards the Western powers, and he took drastic measures to assert control and influence whenever he could to protect the Soviet Union or enhance its interests, such as with the USSR's harsh occupation policy in Eastern Germany and aggressive resource extraction along with the suppression of dissent and opposition to communist rule in the Eastern European satellite states. So to say the least, from historical observation, Stalin was far from being a kind and forgiving person. He was extremely sensitive to any action by others that were seemingly provocative even when unintended, and he would respond at all costs to neutralize perceived threats, whether through suppression, hostility, or confrontation. The historian John Geddes drew a similarity between how Stalin ruled domestically and how he formulated Soviet foreign policy. Possessing the character of an absolutist, Stalin gave no room for concessions on both fronts, and when it came to foreign policy, this stance would inevitably lead to disagreement and conflict. Domestically, Stalin had conducted numerous purges of officials and military commanders for no reason other than to secure his grip on power, most notably during the Great Purge from 1936 to 1938. Stalin's role in enforcing the 1933 terror famine of Ukraine further demonstrates the brutality and firm resolve which prevent him from seeking compromise. This parallels Stalin's foreign policy, where he was easily provoked into suspicion and distrust, and would respond with force and confrontation if necessary. It is as such that Stalin's personality accelerated the development of the Cold War by escalating tensions and mutual distrust, with some historians proposing that the Cold War was inevitable so long as Stalin was in power. As he himself once said, "I trust no one, not even myself."
Truman played a significant role in the start of the Cold War. An understanding of his background is essential in the examinations of his actions and motivations of his hard-lined approach and the implementation of the Truman Doctrine. First, Truman's self-tutelage in history, based on didactic Victorian biographies, instilled a belief that current events had precise historical analogues, leading him to apply inexact analogies about 1930s appeasement to post-war disputes with the Soviet Union. Truman was also untutored in foreign affairs, which led to him assuming a problematic black-and-white worldview. He took reports produced by the White House aides at face value, such as what was written in American relations with the Soviet Union. As explored, Truman's background led to his policies being largely influenced by George Kennan's long telegram, despite the fact that the portrayal of the USSR was one-sided and reductionistic. A Upon examining some of the motivations of the implementation of the Truman Doctrine, such as it being a response to the increasing criticism from Congress and public sentiment of not tolerating additional concessions to the Russians, it seemed as if Truman had no choice but to take on a hard-lined approach in response to internal pressure. Perceived external threats served as further justification for the implementation of the Truman Doctrine. Truman claimed that the USSR's quest was to eventually take over resources of power centers in the world. Stalin's efforts to establish control in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Eastern Germany, Turkey, Iran, and Manchuria between 1944 and 1946 made it seemingly impossible for Truman to continue Roosevelt's policy of cooperation. Yet, it is important to note that Truman very much exaggerated the threat of the Soviet Union. A point of view is that by doing so, he could respond to internal pressure to deal with the threat of Soviet expansionism and easily galvanize and unify American public opinion for the abandonment of the recent and still lingering isolationism and support for an expansionist foreign policy. In fact, pieces of evidence show that the Soviet threat to Western Europe was not as severe as what Truman portrayed it to be. The Soviet Union demobilized its forces after the war, dropping to about 2.9 million personnel in 1948. Many of its 175 divisions were understrength and large numbers were engaged in occupation duties, resisting challenges to Soviet authority in Eastern Europe. At most, Soviets had 700 to 800,000 troops available for an attack against the West. To resist such an attack, the West had about 800,000 troops, or approximate parity. Intelligence sources emphasized Soviet military and economic weakness, not strengths, hesitancy, and not boldness. The very reason for Truman implementing the doctrine was to fulfill his personal desires as a leader, and the first instances of financial aid was in itself a manifestation of the exaggeration of the Soviet threat. Greece was beset by civil war, and the British could no longer afford to fund a war against communist-led insurgents. On March 12, 1947, Truman enunciated a universal doctrine. It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. However, there was no evidence of Soviet involvement in the Greek Civil War. In fact, the Soviets had urged both the Greek communists and their allies the Yugoslavs to stop the fighting for fear the conflict would draw the US into the Mediterranean region. As for Turkey, official Washington did not expect the Soviet Union to strike militarily against Turkey as they were too weak in 1947 to undertake such an operation.